In this video, we'll do a quick overview of the key ideas of Chapter 5. Now, before we talk about Chapter 5, I just want to mention that pretty much in all these lessons, we're still referring to the ideas from Chapter 4. So if you haven't mastered Chapter 4, I would strongly recommend you to go over those ideas and clear them up a bit if you have any issues before you do Chapter 5. For example, if you haven't memorized your identities still, you should definitely go and memorize your compound angle, double angles, and all that good stuff. Okay, so the first big idea of Chapter 5 is to graph all 6 trig functions and learn about the properties. So for example, you need to know how to graph sine x, cos x, tan x, cosecant x, secant x, tan x. And what about the properties? So the properties for all 6 trig functions you can talk about. It's not applicable to all of them, but you can talk about amplitude, domain, range, zeros, x-intercepts, the vertical asymptotes, equation of the axis, period. So any property for any of the 6 trig functions. Now, like I said, you can't, for example, you can't talk about amplitude for cosecant x. Or you can't talk about x-intercepts for secant x, because secant x doesn't have any x-intercepts. And if you're having trouble remembering the properties, always think back to sine x and cos x. If someone asks me for the properties of cotan x, immediately I express cotan x into cos x over sine x. So with my knowledge of cos and sine, I can answer all the properties that you want me to tell you about cotan x. So if someone asks me, where do the vertical asymptotes of cotan x occur? I immediately think of when sine x is equal to 0, because cotan is cos over sine. Anyways, sine and cos are very helpful. So secant x depends on the properties of secant is cos, and cosecant is dependent on the properties of sine, and tan is sine over cos, and cotan is cos over sine. Okay, so one last time, if you have any problems, just think about sine and cos. Now the next big idea is basically what you did in grade 11. So you're given the equation, you can extract key information. So you can determine the period, the amplitude, the equation of the axis. If we give you information, you can solve for the period, or solve for the k value, or solve for the amplitude. So somehow, some way, you need to be able to gather A, K, D, and C. Now if we gave you A, K, D, and C, then you have to be able to tell us what the amplitude is, what's the period, what's the horizontal shift, and what's the equation of the axis. Or we can also ask you in terms of transformations. What's the vertical stretch factor? What's the vertical translation? But that's pretty much a review. It's exactly the same as what you did in grade 11. So this is also what you did in grade 11. If I gave you an equation, you have to be able to give me a graph. So there are a few ways to do it. So I'm going to just plot some points. So I need 5 points to get myself 1 cycle of the sine or cosine function. So what you can do is plot the very first point based on your horizontal translation and whether it's a sine or cosine. So let's say it's cosine, okay? So the first point is a max, okay? If it doesn't have a reflection across the x-axis, the next point is going to be on the axis, equation of the axis. Now this, I moved a quarter period, and I move another quarter period, another quarter period, another quarter period, and I'll get my 5 points. I didn't make a symmetrical wave. It's not perfect, but that's as good as it gets without the grid lines. So another strategy, so I'll plot the same point based on the fact that I know what the horizontal translation is, and it's a cosine without a reflection across the x-axis. So another strategy is to plot the 5th point, because you know the period, so you know the end point of this cycle. So this is the end point, this is the beginning. So with these 2 points, you can plot the 3rd point. With the 1st and 5th point, you can plot the 3rd point. So it's halfway between, and it's a minimum point. And then how do you plot the second point? Well, halfway between the first and third point, because it's a beautiful symmetrical wave. And the fourth point is halfway between the third and the fifth point. So I still personally prefer the quarter period, but I just want to mention this. I did talk about this very briefly in one of my lessons. So whatever approach you want to take, you can go do that, okay? But at the end of the day, the goal is still the same. I give you equation, you give me graph. Okay? There are even more ways to graph the trig function, but I would argue these are two of the most straightforward ways. I still prefer the quarter period because I really like to stress the fact that the horizontal distance between adjacent key points is a quarter period. Anyways, the next big thing was graph to equation. So I give you the graph, you give me the equation. You have to be able to extract the amplitude, equation axis, horizontal shift, and the k value. That is from the period. So this is actually, I find most students are actually very good at this. And you should have also done this in grade 11. Okay, number 5. So this is where most students struggle. Solving trig equations. Okay, it's basically the intense algebra part to this chapter. So a lot of students have a hard time with this, and the best thing I can suggest is first, memorize your identities, because if it involves the use of an identity, you need to know your identities. And secondly, you should ask yourself, what is the restriction on x? Okay, because that makes a huge difference. That can really change how many solutions you're going to get for that given equation. So is x from 0 to 2 pi? Is it from 0 to 4 pi? Is it negative 2 pi to 5 pi? Like, you need to know your restriction. But generally speaking, most of the questions, especially ones in the textbook, it's from 0 to 2 pi. So practice all the questions I gave you on the homework sheets, and you'll be a beast when it comes to solving trig equations. And the identities most definitely help. I also want to mention the coterminal angle. So for example, if you had sine 3x equals half, how many answers will you get for sine 3x equals half? Well, a lot of students are going to write this, okay? If sine 3x equals half, this is what a lot of students write. 3x equals pi over 6, or 3x equals 5 pi over 6. So quadrant 1, quadrant 2. And it's pi over 18 and 5 pi over 18. And I'm going to say, I didn't write it earlier, but x is from 0 to 2 pi. So a lot of students get this. Okay, they get pi over 18 and 5 pi over 18. It's not entirely wrong, but it's not right. So first of all, I see sine 3x equals half. I immediately think there are 6 solutions if the interval is from 0 to 2 pi. I immediately see 6 solutions because I see 3 cycles from 0 to 2 pi. And in each cycle, I see 2 solutions. So I know there are 6 answers. But a lot of students write this, and that's only 2 answers. I mean, they're not wrong, but where are the other 4 answers? So if you look in my lessons, you'll see that whenever I see a 3x or anything x, I'm going to study the coterminal angles. So I would write 3x equals pi over 6 plus 2k pi. 5 pi over 6 plus 2k pi. You know what? I'll just write it for you. So yes, 3x equals pi over 6. Beautiful. 2k pi. Any angle coterminal to pi over 6 will also give me a ratio of 1/2. 5 pi over 6 plus 2k pi. K is an integer. So x is pi over 18 plus 2k pi over 3. Okay. So since there's a restriction on x, so we got pi over 18, 5 pi over 18, and then where are my other 4 answers coming from? I take this pi over 18 and add by 2 pi over 3. I'll just do 1/18 plus 2/3. So that's 13 pi over 18. And then add by 2/3 again. That's going to be 25 pi over 18. And I'm going to take 5 pi over 18 and add by 5 pi over 18 plus 2 pi over 3. So that's 17 pi over 18. And then do it one more time. So that's 29 pi over 18. And I assure you, these 6 answers are all values of x from 0 to 2 pi. So these are all acceptable. Okay, and there's my 6 answers that I expected. So be wary, because this is a very common question on a test. Okay, so trig word problems is the last thing we did. So if you're really, really good with solving trig equations, then the trig word problems will be no problem. So they're very similar to the problems we did last year, the Ferris wheel, the tide, the spring. Yeah, they're very similar. So some of the word problems we give you will have the equation provided to you. But if we don't provide you the equation, what you need to do is take the information we give you in the question and build the model, build the equation. So get the parameters a, k, d, c, using the max value, min value, period, and all that stuff. And after you build the model, you're probably going to have to solve a trig equation. Okay, and just be careful, find the correct solutions. If they want infinite solutions, give them infinite solutions. But you have to find all the answers on the given interval that they ask for. So sometimes there are 2 answers, sometimes there are 4 answers. Just be very careful. Be mindful of what they're asking of you. Okay, so that's basically all of chapter 5.